that's still the case after this. So, while we're kind of getting things ready, what can you tell me about Revelation chapters 1 through 5 that you learned? Just one thing, perhaps, that you learned. One quick thing.
John's writing letters to the 7 churches of Asia, and he's telling them how well they did.
We said and. So there you go. So yes, John is writing to the 7 churches of Asia, Asia Minor. What else?
He's having a vision of Christ.
He's having a bunch of visions. The first one is of Christ. Yes. Anyone else want to add to something you learned from last time? Could be anything. True.
John is in exile on the island of Patmos.
Okay, so he's on an island and he's in exile. He's basically in prison. Very good. Etta.
It's in during 96 AD, or either 96 or 68.
Yes, two real possibilities, and we believe that, or at least I believe that John writes in 96 AD during the time of which emperor? Did we say? Yes. Nero was one option, and I'm not going to say that that's a wrong option. The one that I think is starts with D.
No. It's a coin.
Domitian. I'll just give it to you. It's Domitian, but that's okay. Hey, don't be afraid. Wrong answers, they're okay because you're trying. So, don't be afraid to give the wrong answers or get up here and stutter. Anyways, I appreciate y'all drawing. I'm going to try to look at them afterwards. I didn't get to color mine. Here's mine. I did Revelation chapter 4. If you'd like to look at it, I'll put it up there. And I failed in doing colors, so you can reprimand me for that. All right, so we learned about really an intro last time of Revelation chapters 1 through 5, and then an intro. But you can kind of see me everywhere over here. Okay. I know we're missing a few, and hopefully, I want to stress that if there are any questions after this, make sure to ask Chandra. No. She has great resources, and no greater resource than the Bible. But no, if you do have questions, you can ask me. I may not know them all, the answers to them all, but I'll do my best to give you a Bible answer, and that applies to students and moms, parents. If you, we'll have my email and phone, and that way, if you do have a question, whether it's about Revelation or something else in the Bible that kind of pertains to it, just let me know. I'd be happy to answer that. All right, we're going to go really fast today. So try to keep up, and I hope everyone has a Bible that they can look at or share with someone and kind of go there. And before we get into the chapters, we're going to go through and just kind of summarize each chapter. We'll look at some of the verses inside there. But I wanted to remind you we talked a little bit about this one last time. The visions kind of come in cycles. The overall message is the same, but the visions change, and the symbols change a little bit. And so just remember that mainly the overall idea is being said, but he's seeing different visions, because if you saw a vision of 7, we're going to look at 7 seals being opened. Well, if you're watching this vision, it might be kind of confusing at first with everything going on, and so then it gives time for John to say, okay, well, this is similar here. and remember those things. So we'll talk more about it as we go. I didn't mention this last time, but the word apocalyptic literature is a type of literature found commonly in the Bible, a lot in the Old Testament. And so if you don't know some of the images that are in the Old Testament, you're going to have a problem with some of the images that are in Revelation, because he pulls from the apocalyptic language of Ezekiel and Daniel very heavily, and even more so, all throughout the Old Testament and through the prophets. But the word apocalypse, apocalypsis means to uncover. And I always thought that was interesting because the word itself, to me, would kind of seem like it means you're hiding something. But it's actually saying you're unhiding it. I don't know if that's the right word. But you're uncovering it. You're revealing it. That's why it's called the Revelation. In Revelation chapter 1, everyone open up there to Revelation chapter 1. In verse number 1, you'll see that it's going to say the revelation of Jesus Christ. The first or the second word there in most translations. The revelation. That revelation is that word apocalypsis, and that's where we get that idea. But it's important to note that a lot of what we're going to see in chapter 6 through 22 is a revealing. And it's not a covering up. In one sense it is, and we'll talk more about that. But lastly, and just as important, if not more important, figurative language. It's not just apocalyptic and uncovering, but there's symbols. We talked about symbols last time, where they represent something, but they aren't the actual thing. And a lot of them, the images come from the Old Testament. So just remember that as we try to go through. And I thought this book had a pretty good two things to say about these ideas. Let the Bible interpret the Revelation. And I think that's what we want to do all the time. And so if you have a question, and it's about an image, it's likely found in the Old Testament somewhere. We go back and find out what he was trying to use. And then about the idea of Revelation being an uncovering, a revealing, it says this: Revelation is not a mystery. It is an uncovering of the mind of God in the conflict of the church with the forces of evil. It is not a revelation of the specific facts of material history in any age or in any specific persons, but of certain principles and characters which will appear in some degree in all generations. So that's now recorded. If you need that quote, you can refer back to that. But or look at the book later and write it down. So we kind of understand everything so far, at least those three ideas. All right, so, and hopefully you drew either chapter 4 or chapter 5, and so we're going to take off from here. Again, try to just follow along in your Bibles, because we're going to look at some of the verses there. Other than that, we're just going to summarize it, and then I'll maybe take, if we have some time, for questions at the end. Or if not, I could stay after for questions anyway, either way. Chapter 4 is the throne scene of God, right? And so we see the greatness, we see who we're supposed to worship, that is God and God alone. And then the Lamb in chapter 5, worthy is the Lamb to do what? To take the scroll, right? We have this scroll, and there's 7 seals. In the vision, they're not taped, just by the way. They are the Lamb was the only one worthy to even hold the scroll. So I'm pretending to be the Lamb right now. Except I'm standing. But anyways. So we've got these 7 seals on this one scroll. And we're going to find out what this scroll kind of is, in a sense, as we see the 7 seals being opened. Some of them will happen in chapter 6, 7, and I think 8. Yes. So let's begin there, chapter 6. Everyone kind of look, Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, and we'll begin. Remember, John is seeing visions. He says, "Now when I saw the Lamb opened one of the seals." So he took one of these and he ripped it off, or he opened it. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, verse 2, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Okay, so before we start, we're not going to get into interpreting every single sign in here, but each seal is going to help us determine what's happening here. So there's the first seal, a white horse. He's given a bow, like a bow and arrow, I believe, and a crown. And this crown is not it's not like a medal, but it's a victory crown, a conquering crown, because he's going to conquer. And so then the second seal is opened, and a red horse. He's given a sword and a knife. And then the idea is that he's bringing war. He's bringing war. So there's this conquering horse. Then there's this war, or horse of war. And then the black horse. The third seal is opened. And so John, remember, John is seeing these things. First seal open, then this happens, and maybe it's over here. Then the second seal, this happens, and it's right here. And it's just unfolding. That's what we're going to try to do in this way. So the third seal, black horse, a pair of scales is given to him, not like scales of a fish, but weight, scales for weight. And he's measuring things, but the idea is that there's going to be famine. Those scales are going to be important because of the famine that's coming. The fourth seal, the pale horse, and he is given power over a quarter of the earth and a judgment sword. And so the pale horse is coming. It represents the idea of death. I believe it says he's death. Death is on him, right? The name of him who sat on it, verse 8, was death, and Hades followed with him. And so there are these things, someone that's conquering with war and famine, and then judgment based on death. And so there's death there. So we see the fifth seal comes. We're still in chapter 6. The fifth seal comes, and the souls of the martyrs, the people, the Christians that have died, that's what a martyr is, they've died for their faith, right? They are crying out under the altar. So there's two important questions, two very important questions in chapter 6 that the rest of the book hangs on, hinges on. It depends on these questions. And it starts with these questions. Verse number 10. Everyone, Revelation 6, verse 10. They, the martyrs, cried with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" They're crying out, how long? How long are you going to let... They're crying out to God, saying this, how long are you going to let your people die? How long is this going to go on? We've died for our faith, and we're watching more and more die for their faith. How long? And so that's the first question. And they said, how long until you avenge us? They know that God's going to avenge them at some point. And so they're asking how long, and their answer is there in verse number 7. Then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren will be killed as they were was completed. And God says, or God through the angel, however it is, says this, just a little bit longer. Don't worry, I've got things under control, he says. It is that I'm watching. I know that they're being killed, but they're being killed for their faith. And God says, just a little bit longer. And so this was supposed to be an encouraging letter to the 7 churches of Asia. It was supposed to be an encouraging letter. How is this encouraging? We've got to wait a little bit longer and watch our fellow brothers and sisters die? Well, because number one, God hears their cries. That should be encouraging. God is saying, look, I hear you, and I also hear those who are on the earth. And the thing is, they're rewarded for their faithfulness. There's an encouragement there. But he tells them, don't worry. It's not too much longer. I've got things under control. So we come to the 6th seal at the end of chapter 6. We are moving very slow. And maybe you think we're moving fast, but we're moving slow. The judgment on Rome by the Lamb. And we'll talk about how this is the idea of Rome later. But this is a symbol of judgment is given. And none of these things seem to literally happen at this time, in this way. Think about in verse number 12. There's a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. None of those things literally happened. It's an Old Testament sign and symbol of judgment. And so judgment's coming. None of these things actually happened, but the idea is judgment there. On who? We'll find out that is Rome and Roman Empire and everyone who's persecuting God's people. And so people are trying to hide from the wrath of God, from this judgment in verse 15. They tried to hide themselves in caves, but the thing is you can't hide in the day of his wrath. The last question is in verse 17 of verse number 6, the second question. Chapter 6, verse number 17. So how long? God says not too much longer. Then verse 17, he says, or they are crying out this, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Or who can stand? Now that's the second question that the rest of this is going to come from. Who is able to stand in the day of God's wrath? And it's answered in chapter 7 and following. So now we're in chapter 7. The answer is there, verse number 4. I heard the number of those who were sealed. So these are the sealed that are on the earth, and we'll note that it's the 144,000. Again, not a literal number, but a figure. We talked about the symbols. 12, that's a multiple of 12. It was the idea of completion, but also of God's people. And it's just symbolizing how many, it's all of God's people that were sealed. And so you see there, but then later in the chapter 7, verse 13, who are these arrayed in white robes, and where did they come from? They're asking this, and he answers himself in this way. Verse number 14. These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And so these are the ones that overcome. We talked about, that's one of our themes. The two themes are overcoming and worship, right? Throughout the book of Revelation, overcoming. And so it's these who have overcome, and John is seeing them before the throne of God. And they're serving him, verse 15, day and night. Then, verse number 17 of chapter 7, for the Lamb who is in the midst of his throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of waters. And so we see the Lamb is in the midst of them, and he's their shepherd. Of course, we know that to be Jesus. Chapter 8. So we're only on the 6th seal. We've gotten 6 of them open. There's one left. You can't open this if there's one left, right? You can kind of maybe see parts of it, but you can't see the whole thing. So, the 7th seal is opened, and this is what happens, verse number 1 of chapter 8. There was silence in heaven for about half an hour. For 30 minutes. All these things are happening, one after the other, and then suddenly just nothing. And not even, an air conditioner, fans, or anything like that, right? There is nothing going on. It is nothing. Well, maybe he's outside. I don't know. I kind of picture John outside seeing his vision. But anyways. Alright, so there's silence. The 7th one is open. There's silence because the wrath of God's been poured out. And then we're going to watch 7 more things. We saw the 7 seals, and now we're going to look at the 7 trumpets. Right here. There we go. We'll look at it. Alright, so the 7 trumpets. We're going to keep going until we get faster and faster as I look at time. 7 trumpets. Trumpet is an idea for warning or victory or even movement. And so you're going to sound a trumpet when these happen. 7 angels appear with 7 trumpets before the throne of God. And another angel, an 8th one, takes fire from the altar, throws it to earth, and there's noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. Again, not literal things. First trumpet sounds, hail, fire, and blood are thrown to earth, and 1/3 of the trees and grass are burned up. Remember, so think about what we're going to look at, a bunch of thirds that are happening. It just means partial judgment here on the earth. The second trumpet sounds, and a burning mountain is thrown into the sea. And try to picture these things. And 1/3 of the sea is turned to blood. 1/3 of the sea creatures died, and 1/3 of the ships are destroyed. A third trumpet sounds, and a great star fell. Again, not literal ideas. 1/3 of the rivers and springs are made bitter and cause mankind to die. A fourth trumpet. 1/3 of the sun, 1/3 of the moon, 1/3 of the stars are darkened. And an angel goes throughout heaven saying, woe to the inhabitants of the earth because of the remaining trumpet sounds. And so this is just the first 4, that all these things are happening in succession. The 5th trumpet sounds, and locusts come up from the bottomless pit, and with power to do what? To harm men without God's seal. And they have a king or a leader named in the Hebrew Abaddon or Apollyon in the Greek. Ask me later who I might think that is. But the idea is that it's a destroyer. But they have power to harm or injure those without the seal of God. So they don't have the seal of God. The sixth trumpet sound, 4 angels bound at the Euphrates River, released to kill 1/3 of mankind by 3 plagues of fire, smoke, and brimstone. And the thing is, there were many killed, and those who were not killed, did not repent of their false worship and the things that they are going to. I think that's yeah, I already went over to chapter 9. So, chapter 10. Chapter 10, there's kind of an interlude here. So the 6 trumpets have sounded. We're waiting on the 7th. And before that, chapter 10, a mighty angel comes down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. And he brings a little book to John. He brings this little book. And he tells John to seal it up. He tells him, close it, and then eat it. Again, not literal things. John is probably doing that, but in a vision. And this is pointing back to Ezekiel. Ezekiel did the same thing. He was told to eat the book. Anyways, so it's all figurative language. But John is saying that they're saying, hold on to this for a time. Because at the end of Revelation, we'll see that he's told to unseal the book. Chapter 11. Chapter 11, John is given a measuring rod. He's told to measure the temple, the altar in the temple, and then those who worship, to measure them. Those who are worshiping in the temple, except for the outside court, which belonged to the Gentiles. And 2 witnesses are sent out to preach for 1,260 days. Well, remember our symbols we talked about last time. 1,260 days is equal to 3.5 years. So 3.5 is half of 7. It's a definite but incomplete amount of time. And so there's 2 witnesses sent out to preach in this way. They are killed by the beast and then resurrected 3.5 days later by God, and then they ascend to heaven by God's power. And the 7th trumpet sounds at the end of chapter 11. And voices in heaven say this. What verse is it? Chapter 12. Chapter 11. That's probably it. I probably just missed it. So, voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and of His Christ, and He shall reign forever and ever. Remember, this is an encouragement. And He's saying that, we'll see in the end, Rome is going to fall. Rome is not the greatest kingdom in the world because that's God's kingdom. God's kingdom is going to outlast all of Rome, and Rome is going to fall. And so the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and His Christ. Chapter 12. This is where it gets even crazier. But remember, figurative language. Figurative language. Chapter 12. The woman, there's this woman, she gives birth to a male child who would rule all nations. Well, who does that sound like? Jesus. That's spoiler alert. So, then a fiery red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on those heads. And his tail draws 1/3 of the stars of heaven to earth, and he seeks to devour the woman's child. So again, it's getting kind of crazy, right? This is where, but think about it. It's all, just visualize it. But don't think about what things represent yet. We'll get to it. The woman flees into the wilderness and is fed by God for 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years, right? An incomplete but determined amount of time by God. She flees, and God is providing for her in the wilderness. There is war in heaven. Again, in my mind, it's not literal. War in heaven. Michael and the angels of God fought with the dragon. And there's this dragon, and the dragon is cast down to earth. What does that tell us? The dragon loses. The dragon will know as is the devil. Him and his angels, they lose just against the angels of God. God doesn't even need his power, but he gives the angels enough power to cast the devil down. And so that should tell us the power of God and how powerless, in some sense, Satan and the devil is. Alright, so verse number 11 though. They overcame him, they overcame the dragon by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Think about that. We believe that this woman in chapter 12 to be God's people. And she gives birth to Jesus, right? And then Jesus and his offspring are us, the Christians, as we follow him. But later there's another woman, and it's not going to be the same one. So just recall that just because a symbol is the same, it is used twice in the book, does not mean that it represents the same thing later. It can be, but we'll see later it doesn't. Chapter 13. There is a great beast from the sea with what? It looks kind of like the dragon, doesn't it? 7 heads and 10 horns. But this one has 10 crowns. So 10 ruling crowns. And then there's an earth beast with 2 horns. And he causes many to have the mark or the name of the beast. And the number of the beast is what? Chapter 13.
666.
At the very end, right. The number, look with me there. Everyone read. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Remember, 6 means incomplete, imperfect. It's trying to reach to 7, that completion of God, but it can't. And so it's falling short of perfection. But something that's interesting, it basically, we know this isn't literal. People didn't literally have 666 on their head, except for in this vision, right? John is seeing it literally, but it's not things that are happening other than his vision. But if you want to write this down, if you're taking notes, 1 Kings 10 and verse number 14, I don't know if this has any merit, but Revelation is pulling back from the Old Testament.
1 Kings 10, what?
Verse number 14, chapter 10, verse 14. Solomon's yearly income was 666 talents of gold. For me, I think that just means at some point Solomon trusted in his riches more than his God. He trusted in the kingdom of earth and earthly things more than he trusted in God. So it's the same idea here as far as I'm concerned. If he's pulling back from that idea there, it's those who are trusting in Rome at the time. And you can't do that because it's going to fall. That's the idea. All right, let's keep going. Chapter 14. You see the Lamb and on Mount Zion with the 144,000. Again, remember, not literal, but just a figure. This is all of God's people. 144,000 with the Father's name on their foreheads. And 3 proclamations are given. First, worship God. Secondly, Babylon is fallen. And we're talking over and over again, now he's going to use Babylon. What does he mean by Babylon? Anybody? Rome. He's talking about Rome, the Roman Empire. Babylon is long gone. And so, but if he has a letter delivered by Roman governors or whatever, if he says Rome's fallen, they're just going to take that letter, rip it up, burn it up, and we never have Revelation, right? So he's saying Babylon to refer to that great city of old. Rome, who thinks that they are Babylon and really are at that time. So think about the context. Then lastly, the last proclamation in chapter 14 is those who worship the beast will face the wrath of God. Those who worship anything but God will face the wrath of God. Chapter 15. So now we'll have this sort of prelude to the 7 bowls. We had 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and now we have 7 bowls. Bowls that will be plagues containing the wrath of God. And so they saw those who overcame the beast singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. Remember, he's pulling back to the Old Testament, back in Exodus. The song of Moses was one of redemption, one of salvation from sin and that idea there. So then there's a temple opened in heaven, and out came 7 angels. Chapter 16. And the first bowl, and I saw the beast, the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. So all the enemies of God are gathered together. It would kind of look like a picture of me kind of like right here. And if y'all are the enemies of God, just bear with me for a second. They're gathered together against God and his army. At first, it looks like y'all could win. The enemies of God can win. But what happens in verse number 20? Verse number 20, the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence. And the two were cast alive into the lake of fire burning with brimstone. Is that they try to battle with God, and yet before the battle even starts, it wasn't a battle at all. God already won, and he already has. That's the idea here. And great celebration in the end. So we're coming down to the last few chapters, but all of heaven is praising God because he's won. That Rome doesn't win, and the dragon doesn't either. Chapter 20, again, figurative language. The dragon or the devil, this one is the devil. Bound for 1,000 years and then released after this time. And the saints during this 1,000 years are reigning with Christ. And then at some point, the devil is released to deceive the nations for a short time, and then he's cast in the lake of fire. And then all the dead stand before God to be judged. I believe that these are figurative ideas looking at a spiritual message, because it's all connected to what has been happening at this time. Chapter 21, a new heaven and a new earth is seen. Figuratively, John sees these things, and then a new Jerusalem, a new city, comes down from heaven, and John is taken up to see that city. In chapter 22, in that city, he sees, you see the descriptions there, and you can read about those. You see the river of life is there. Verse number 7, though, as we sort of close the book, is John, finally, they're closing with John, and Jesus says, "Behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed is he who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book." So you're blessed if you do or keep and obey the things that are happening in this book, in terms of if you overcome, you can come over, right? That's what we talked about last time as a summary. Verse number 9, John tries to worship someone that isn't God, and they said, don't do that, worship God alone. Verse number 9 at the very end. And then verse number 18 and 19 of chapter 22, we see a warning. Don't add to and don't take away from this book. And that applies to all of God's inspired word, but especially just as much to this very book. He's telling John not to add to it. He's telling anybody not to add to or take away from it. And that's important. We talked about let the Bible interpret the Bible. I know we're kind of out of time, but I told you we go fast. And I know it's a lot to take in. But I hope this gave you kind of an overview of what's happening in each chapter. And again, if you have questions, let me know. Chandra will vet them to me. Or we can show you some good resources, and you can maybe look them up for yourself if you'd like. But the idea is that God wins. Revelation summed up, God wins. Or just God won. He's already won. Right? The battle is not really a battle anymore. It is that the devil in some way is bound, and God has already won. And so, if you want a sentence summary, taking into the context, I could give you this, but here it is. The book of Revelation is a letter from the Apostle John to 7 churches in Asia Minor, facing persecution by the Roman Emperor Domitian, which serves as encouragement, as it predicts the fall of the Roman Empire and the fate of those who overcome. That is my summary. So, if you think it's good, great. If you think it's bad, awesome. Lastly, before we kind of close, I don't have time to write them down, but I can write them down after, and you can take a picture and write them down later. But there's some eternal truths I wanted to get from you. If you were confused by all of this, if you were confused, this is going to help you. We see from chapter 6 through 22, first of all, that evil is present in the world. That evil is sometimes victorious. Sometimes. But when evil wins, it's always temporary. When evil wins, it's always temporary. It never lasts. And so then, number 4, God is present. So if evil is present in the world, God is present in the world. We saw from chapters 1 through 5 that Jesus is present in His church. And then God is always victorious. So if evil is sometimes victorious, well, God is always going to be. And then God's victory is everlasting, right? There's no more wars to be fought in terms of physically. There's spiritual ones that we fight as well, but the battle and the war has been won. And it's eternal. Last 2 things. Christians will suffer on earth. They will. It's going to happen. Jesus talked about it. It's not just new to Revelation. Lastly, we get to choose whether we overcome or not. And how we overcome. Think about this. We could overcome the Christians in the 7 churches that were written to. They could choose to join the evil. Join Rome and say, and forsake God, worship the emperor and all those other things and have this temporary rest. They could overcome in that way. But you're not going to truly overcome and come over with Jesus until you resist the evil. Instead of joining it, you resist it, and then you do what? You get eternal rest. So it's our choice whether we want some temporary rest in this life or we want eternal rest with God. That's kind of the overall idea. Again, if you have questions, let me know. I went a little over some homework. I appreciate you doing that. I'm going to take a look at them. They're all hundreds anyways. But more drawing, because I hope it was fun. I hope it helps you visualize these things and get the overall picture. So draw a scene from chapter 6 through 22. Pick a passage, and I have some listed here if you want. That would be good, but it's up to you. Just one picture. Do the same thing from chapter 6 through 22. All right, well, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. I hope it wasn't too much, because I feel like it was too much. I feel like I just saw all the visions. Anyways.
It was not too much.
So,
Thank you.